Hey guys, welcome to CraterMania. I'm your host, the man they call Crater, and I'd like to welcome you all back to my 500 Movies in 2025 series. And we are now in the month of December, so the countdown has begun to the end of the year here for the 500 Movies in 2025. We're getting closer and closer to that goal. And like I said, since it is December, we're now going to be celebrating Christmas time. It's a CraterMania Christmas all month long here on the 500 movies in 2025. And I'm just, I have loved, Christmas movies growing up since I was a kid. And just because, you've heard me talk about Halloween and these other holidays throughout the year, especially Halloween being my favorite holiday of the year. And, I love all the movies that are kind of based around that. But, Christmas movies were always a big thing for me growing up as well. And, I always had these, yearly traditions with my family of watching, all these different Christmas movies. And as, I would get older, I would kind of like, go out on my own and find these other Christmas movies that I would love, especially in the horror genre, which is one to start off to, this whole CraterMania Christmas all month long by talking about some of my favorite Christmas horror movies. Um, and so that's why this episode is titled horror for the holidays, because I'm going to be talking about several of the ones that I grew up loving, ones I would come to discover years later, in my in my 20s, and just and so on. But yeah, definitely, it's Christmas time. It's a very special time of year for everybody. Now, the movie that we're discussing tonight might not be special to a lot of people who love Christmas, but just mainly just us horror fans who love Christmas as well. Um, and why not just kick this whole thing off with my favorite Christmas horror movie of all time? Um, and before I get into that, I just want to state that before I forget, these are movies 443 through 452 of the 500 movies in 2025. And like I said, why not kick this thing off with my favorite Christmas horror movie of all time? Because, as a devoted fan of both, the Christmas season and, and all things horror, um, just that subgenre of Christmas horror, it really holds, a special place in my heart. And, there's this kind of thrill in seeing, all this iconic imagery of just of comfort and joy and family, just twisted into this kind of backdrop, for terror in horror films. From the mischievous anarchy of just of gremlins to those folkloric frats of Krampus, just the blend of that festive cheer, and just and mortal fear is just this powerful thing, um but while many films have, like kind of came together within this subgenre, there's one for me personally that stands supreme. It's kind of like that grim and silent patriarch that's kind of watching over its descendants, if you will, from just this kind of dark, snow dusted attic. And of course, that film is Bob Clark's 1974 masterpiece, Black Christmas. Um, it's not merely, just a great Christmas horror film. It's really that kind of foundational text, just that alpha and omega of the modern slasher. Um, it's a movie that really just remains as chillingly, effective today, I think, and it was nearly a half a century ago. I mean, this movie is over 50 years old now. And Black Christmas is just this 1974 Canadian horror film that, on the surface presents this kind of simple and now familiar premise. It's Christmas break at this university, and the girls of the Pi Kappa Sigma sorority are, celebrating before, kind of scattering out for the holidays. Um, The house is this kind of swirl of festive energy, and booze and just, a lot of youthful banter between them. But an intrusive presence kind of shatters all this merriment, going on. This these series of just obscene and deeply disturbing phone calls from this man that they nicknamed the Moaner have just been plaguing the house here, and you know these aren't simple prank calls. They're these schizophrenic, you know, terrifying, just these calls filled with just these guttural screams and just these childish like whimpers and these bizarre characters named Billy and Agnes. Um, so the tension kind of escalates from psychological to physical when this unseen intruder, scales the house and takes up residence in the attic. And his first victim is this sweet, quiet, Claire Harrison, played by Lynn Griffin, who is dispatched with just this chilling efficiency, while her sorority sisters, are still partying on and they're oblivious, all downstairs. Um, and just her disappearance really sets the plot into motion here, but the film wisely avoids turning into like a straightforward mystery. Instead, it just becomes this kind of masterclass in this like sustained dread. um and the film introduces us to this memorable cast of characters who feel far more authentic than the slasher types that they would later inspire. So our main protagonist here is Jess Bradford, played by the brilliant Olivia Hussey. Um, and Jess is this thoughtful and just resilient, young woman grappling with this major life decision, because she's pregnant, and just much to the fury of her intense neurotic boyfriend Peter, she has decided to have this abortion. And then there is the unforgettable Barb, which is played with just this perfection by Margot Kidder. And she is this foul mouth, you know, hard drinking heart of the group, really. Just kind of where she provides these moments of just this kind of sharp, cynical humor that will make her eventual fate all the more kind of tragic. Um, and just rounding out, that core group you know, um, is their house mother, Mrs. McHenry, and who has this secret stash of alcohol hidden all throughout the house. But anyway, so as the police, who are led by the competent but initially skeptical Lieutenant Fuller, played by John Saxon, as they begin to investigate, the killer's phone calls continue growing, more personal and more menacing. And just the film's most iconic, I think, and influential element soon, reveals itself. The killer is already inside the house. And director Bob Clark, he masterfully uses these point of view shots from the killer's perspective, and it makes the audience, just this kind of unwilling accomplice to the horror. Um, so, as we peer through these cracks and doors and stalk the hallways and just watch these unsuspecting victims, our sense of helplessness and that kind of claustrophobia, mounts with each scene. Um, and the murders are not these kind of gratuitous gore fest. They're these brutal, intimate, and just creative in the horror of it all. Like the plastic bag, over the face, and a crane hook, and just a crystal unicorn figurine. All these mundane objects are just transformed into these instruments of death. Um, and the film's ending is just kind of this crescendo of unbearable suspense. So after this, a trace that was finally confirms the calls are coming from the inside. Jess is plunged into this fight for her life, and the final act kind of subverts these expectations brilliantly. The police and even the audience are led to believe that the main red herring, Peter, is the killer. And after Jess defends herself, the authorities arrive, and declare, the threat has been neutralized, and it leaves our, traumatized final girl to rest. But Bob Clark delivers I think, one of the greatest endings, in horror, at least slasher history. Um, as the camera pans away from Jess's supposedly safe bedroom, up to the attic where the bodies of Claire and Mrs. Mack, they remain undiscovered, and we hear the killer's whispers, and they're still in the house, and the film ends not with any kind of resolution, but with just this kind of, chilling, unanswered ringing of the sorority house telephone, which I think is kind of like this final horrifying promise that, the nightmare is far from over. Um, so to truly appreciate, the genius of Black Christmas, one must understand just the man who directed it. So Bob Clark is, a name that might cause, a double take for, those unfamiliar with his, career. So he is the same filmmaker who, less than a decade later, would direct one of the most beloved, heartwarming, and nostalgic Christmas classics of all time, A Christmas Story, from 1983. And the fact that the same mind conceived both the pure, unadulterated terror of Billy's attic lair, and also this whimsical nostalgia of Ralphie's quest for a Red Ryder BB gun is definitely, a testament to just an incredible and perhaps, unparalleled directorial, versatility. Um, Bob Clark's filmography also includes Porky's from 1981, which it further cements his status as this filmmaker who would just defy this that kind of easy categorization. Um, and this kind of unique duality for him is definitely key because Bob Clark understood what made that sanctity of the home and the holidays feel so safe, which allowed him to kind of so expertly violate that safety in Black Christmas. Um, and while John Carpenter's Halloween from 1978 is often credited with inventing the modern slasher film, I think a lot of horror fans know um, that it was simply perfecting the formula. That Halloween was just simply perfecting that formula that Black Christmas had created just 4 years earlier in 1974. And I mean, the DNA of nearly every slasher that followed can be found, in Black Christmas. Just the killer's point of view shot, the final girl theme, just a cast of young people being, systematically, killed off one by one. Um, a holiday setting, as this backdrop for murder, and just that terrifying concept of the call is coming from inside the house. That was all pioneered and perfected here in Black Christmas. John Carpenter himself, has acknowledged this and just acknowledged that influence that Black Christmas had on him when he was developing Halloween. But, beyond its kind of technical innovations, the movie's legacy, is in that kind of maturity, that startling maturity that it has. Jess Bradford, who's played by Olivia Hussey, is arguably, I think, one of horror's most, progressive final girls. Um, just her subplot that involved her pregnancy, and just that decision to have this abortion is not just a throwaway detail. It's a central part, of her character and just the film's kind of dramatic tension. Um, and in this kind of era before, Roe versus Wade had fully settled into the cultural landscape that it has today, um, this was an incredibly bold and nuanced storyline for a horror film. Um, and it gives Jess, kind of this agency and this real world complexity that was, often stripped you know, from films at this time. One and these kind of one dimensional, heroines of that 1980s slasher boom. She isn't fighting a monster because she's a virgin. She's fighting for her future, for her right to choose her own path. Um, but the film's ultimate power, however, comes just from the it being so ambiguous. Just unlike so many of its successors, Black Christmas refuses to explain its monster. We never see Billy's face. We never learn his motive. Is he a former resident, an escaped patient, a supernatural entity? The movie offers no answers to this. And understanding that the most terrifying evil is that which is random and unknowable and without any kind of reason. Um, this refusal to explain away the horror is what allows it to kind of burrow so deep, into the viewer's mind. And there were two remakes of this film. First in 2006, and then again in 2019. And I think that those, even the remakes, even though they will, never live up to the original film, they serve as testaments just to the original's power by their very failure to recapture it. The 2006 version made that cardinal sin, of giving Billy this convoluted, grotesque backstory, and it deflates all. Excuse me. It deflates all the mystery of it. And then the 2019 version, it abandoned the original's premise almost entirely in favor of this, heavy-handed social message, losing that kind of raw, primal terror in the process. Um, but every year, as Christmas comes around, I will watch all the holiday, the Christmas classics, with that I grew up since I was a kid, loving with my family, and now I share with my family. But I also got to have that holiday horror marathon as well. And every year it always starts with the same one, Black Christmas. Um, it's more than just a scary movie for me. It's this masterclass in atmosphere and suspense and the psychological dread. It weaponizes just the cozy comfort of the holiday season, and just turning these kind of familiar carols into an eerie score, and just a festive home into this death trap. And Bob Clark, he didn't just make a horror film, set at Christmas. He crafted this film that understands that true terror, often comes from just the violation of the sacred and the corruption of the innocent. It's a seminal work that laid the groundwork for an entire genre. All while telling this kind of smarter, more patient, more terrifying story, than most of its imitators would. Um, it's a film that respects its audience, um, enough to not give them easy answers, and leaving them with that kind of chilling, ambiguity of that final, ringing phone. So forget all the twinkling lights and the Christmas carols, and for true fans of holiday horror, the season doesn't officially begin until that phone rings at the Pi Kappa Sigma house, and and Billy's unholy voice whispers down the line. So if you've never seen Black Christmas, please give it a shot. Like I said, it's my favorite Christmas horror movie of all time. Next on the list, so we've talked about the sorority girls, Black Christmas, stalked by Billy up in the attic, and then and we'll talk about some other great horror Christmas films here later on. But up next, I feel like this next film is an overshadowed masterpiece by so many other Christmas horror films, because this one is just a stranger and sadder and just far more psychologically complex film than a lot of these other Christmas horror films. And I'm talking about Lewis Jackson's 1980 cult classic Christmas Evil. Um, so this has been dismissed by some as just another cheap killer Santa movie. But Christmas Evil is, in reality, this very haunting and just deeply sad character study. Just a film that uses, again, that iconic imagery of Christmas, not for these cheap scares, but just to tell this tragic story of this descent of a man who was just broken by the very holiday that he adores. Um so touching upon that, Christmas Evil is the story of Harry Stadling, who was played by Brandon Maggart, and Harry is a man whose entire existence is defined by this single, traumatic childhood moment. So back on Christmas Eve of 1947, a young Harry, creeps downstairs to catch another glimpse of Santa Claus, only to witness Santa, who is just his father dressed up, being sexually intimate with his mother. And this scene doesn't just shatter his belief in Santa, it corrupts the very foundation, of his worldview. Just, fusing the purity of Christmas with this very confusing and screwed up adult reality. Um, so flash forward 33 years, and we find this adult Harry, now working this dead end job, at the Jolly Dreams toy factory. So he is just a man that is desperately trying to, embody that pure, idealized version of Santa that was stolen from him all those years ago. And his apartment is just a shrine to Christmas. He sleeps in his Santa suit. He's obsessively spies on these neighborhood children. Just kind of keeping these kind of detailed notes of who is naughty and who is nice. And Brandon Maggart's performance is the key here to the film's success. He doesn't play Harry as this monster or or a caricature or anything. He plays him with this kind of profound sense of loneliness and this kind of wounded innocence. We see the pain in his eyes when his coworkers are mocking him, or when he witnesses just the hypocrisy of his bosses who plan this hollow charity donation for publicity while exploiting their workers. um and in the film, it builds that pressure, on Harry's, fragile mind, as the film goes on. A coworker's lie, a corporate Christmas party built on these false pretenses, and just those constant reminders, of a commercialized, uncaring world, all just kind of chip away, at him as it goes on. And on Christmas Eve, as he glues this Santa beard to his face. Um, Something finally snaps in him, and he doesn't just put on a costume. he in his mind becomes Santa Claus, and so he embarks on this journey just to reward the good, and for the first time punish the wicked. So his van now painted on the side is a sleigh, like Santa's sleigh, and it just becomes his kind of almost like magical chariot. So he's delivering all these stolen toys to these deserving children at this local hospital, and he leaves bags of dirt for the naughty. Um, but when this group of churchgoers start to mock his appearance, the switch is flipped, and just that purity of his mission is now tainted by the world's cynicism, and he retaliates with this kind of sudden shocking violence, just transforming from this benevolent spirit into this kind of angel of vengeance. um and just the murders that would follow are not random acts of a slasher. There are these targeted judgments from just his twisted Santa centric moral code, I guess you'd say. um but to talk about the director of this movie, um just and Lewis Jackson, just unlike horror contemporaries, but like John Carpenter or Wes Craven, Lewis Jackson is not this prolific genre titan by any means. Christmas Evil remains his primary, cinematic legacy, and it's clear that this was a deeply personal project, not a cynical cash grab. Lewis Jackson wasn't interested in crafting a standard slasher film with a high body count. Instead, he drew more from that kind of gritty psychological character studies of the 1970s, like Taxi Driver, and Harry Stadling is this kind of um, Yuletide Travis Bickle, a lonely, alienated man just pushed to the brink by a society that he finds morally bankrupt. And Lewis Jackson's direction emphasizes this with this kind of bleak, melancholic tone that permeates even the most festive scenes. Um, and the film's 1980 New Jersey setting feels authentically drab and working class, just a stark contrast to the magical Christmas fantasy world that Harry is trying to build for himself. um and upon its release, Christmas Evil was largely misunderstood, and just failed to find an audience. It was too strange and introspective for the slasher crowd, and just too tonally grim for mainstream viewers. In the United Kingdom, it was caught up in the whole video nasty panic, and it was seized and confiscated for just its supposedly obscene content. A label that ironically had little to do with gore and more to do with this deeply unsettling um, psychological themes. But its path to legendary cult status was paved by one of its most one of its biggest fans, and that was director John Waters. John Waters, who's considered the Pope of trash, he championed this film and just famously declaring it the greatest Christmas movie ever made. um, and this kind of endorsement really gave the film a new life, and reframing it as not as a failed slasher, but as this kind of brilliant piece of outsider art. Um, and through this kind of lens, viewers began to appreciate its kind of its unique qualities. Unlike the more popular, Silent Night, Deadly Night, which we'll be talking about here in just a little bit. Um, which because Silent Night, Deadly Night was this lean, mean, just effective slasher. And Christmas Evil is more of like a tragic art house horror film. It prioritizes atmosphere and character over kills, and asks the audience to kind of to almost sympathize with its killer. Um, And the legacy of Christmas Evil, I think is secured by its just utterly bizarre and that unforgettable ending. Harry being chased by this torch wielding mob, and which was I think is a direct homage to Frankenstein. Harry confronts his brother. The source of his original disillusionment. Before driving his van off a bridge. And in this moment of just kind of pure cinematic magic, the van doesn't crash. It soars into the sky, flying towards the moon as this gentle voiceover reads the final lines of "'Twas the Night Before Christmas." So this leaves the audience seeing this to think, is it real? Is it that dying fantasy of this broken man? Which that's what I think it is. I think that this is just something that is luring in this in Harry's mind as what he would want to happen, but that's not the reality of things. But the film never tells us, and it leaves us with this kind of haunting and just strangely beautiful final image that just perfectly encapsulates the film's blend of the grim reality and childlike fantasy. So I think that's pretty genius. But Christmas Evil is not a film for everyone. Um, it's kind of this slow burn descent into madness. It's more disturbing than it is frightening. But for horror fans who appreciate a film that subverts expectations and just kind of burrows deep under your skin, it is essential viewing. Brandon Maggart delivers one of the great unsung performances in Christmas horror history. He created this villain who is both, someone that you pity and someone that you feel sorry for, but also you find them terrifying at the same time. It's a film that explores that dark side of holiday cheer, just the pain of disillusionment and just that tragic, consequence of trying to impose a childhood fantasy onto this cruel, adult world. Um, it stands today, I think, as a very unique and just profoundly unsettling masterpiece, especially one that's based around Christmas. And it's to me, it's one of those true um, kings of Christmas horror. So I love Christmas Evil, and I highly suggest everyone check it out. Um, but now, next on to the next film. So, like I said, we will be talking about this film as I mentioned in my last review of Christmas Evil. And for those of us who find more delight in that smell of fake snow mixed with fake blood, then in the scent of pine needles, for instance, um, the Christmas season just really provides us a very unique and twisted canvas for horror filmmaking. And while films like Black Christmas, set the foundational rules for holiday terror, um, there's one film that really dared to kind of desecrate the image, of Saint Nicholas himself with this gleeful, traumatized, abandon, and that's Charles E. Sellers' 1984 slasher masterpiece. Masterpiece in my mind. Silent Night, Deadly Night. And this is not just a great slasher film. It is to me, the ultimate essential, cinematic treat for just the horror fan who believes that the true meaning of Christmas lies in confronting this deep seated trauma with just a razor sharp axe. I'm just kidding, by the way, but I do love this movie. Um, so Silent Night, Deadly Night is more than just a cult film. It's the foundational pillar, of 80s shock cinema. Just a movie that's so controversial upon its release that it caused genuine panic, yet so effective that it is rightly earned its place in that world of holiday horror classics. This film is brilliant. This film is misunderstood. It's expertly paced and just it possesses this kind of thematic depth that contemporaries often lacked. It's to me is a perfect storm. Of that kind of psychological breakdown and that visceral punishment. Um, so Silent Night, Deadly Night is this, psychological study, masquerading as this kind of conventional slasher, I think. The film follows just the agonizing path of Billy Chapman, whose life is, shattered by this single, moment. This were just this brutally formative Christmas Eve experience, when he was just a child. And so the film opens with this sequence that, simultaneously establishes dread and foreshadows just the terrifying, blurring of morality that will define Billy's life. So in 1971, young Billy, visits his grandfather in a nursing home. And in this moment of, this kind of chilling clarity, the grandfather stirs and imparting a single terrifying warning to the young Billy, and says Santa Claus punishes the naughty. And this kind of seemingly, is unsettling pronouncement, immediately establishes Santa not as this, gift giver, but as, this agent of judgment and fear. And this warning becomes cruelly prophetic, moments later, during the family's drive home. So they are ambushed by this criminal who's dressed in a Santa suit, a costume that instantly becomes this symbol of just ultimate malice and betrayal. And Billy is forced to witness the cold blooded murder, of his father, and the sexual assault and murder of his mother. So he survives by hiding and leaving his baby brother Ricky in the car. You know, this event doesn't just traumatize him, it weaponizes just the image of Santa within his mind. And the film establishes its kind of central premise with this stunning efficiency, and that is Santa Claus is death. And the movie's true genius, I think, lies in its decision to to dedicate um, these that significant screen time to Billy's upbringing, and just turning the first act into this kind of psychological origin story that's far more compelling than most slasher villain backstories. So 3 years after the murders in 1974, Billy and Ricky are placed in this Catholic orphanage, which is led by this monstrously effective and stern figure of Mother Superior. Um, and Mother Superior is just the personification of that religious hypocrisy, and abusive discipline. Um, she operates on this very strict, transactional morality where misbehavior, no matter how minor or understandable, you know, requires this swift corporal punishment. And this environment is just a pressure cooker for Billy's existing trauma. Um, and the orphanage years are crucial because they cement Billy's kind of skewed mindset. Um, while the sympathetic Sister Margaret tries to kind of soothe Billy's wounds, Mother Superior she repeatedly beats him and forces him to confront his fear, which culminates in this horrific scene where she attempts to force him onto the lap of this visiting Santa Claus, and Billy explodes, punching the man and and fleeing in terror. Um, and the Mother Superior's that constant mantra of punishment is good, doesn't just discipline Billy, it provides this kind of philosophical framework for his eventual killing spree that he would go on when he gets older. um And he internalizes the idea that violence is the correct and righteous response to this perceived wrongdoing. Um, and by the time that he turns 18, and leaves the orphanage in 1984, Billy is this psychologically cracked vessel, just a ticking time bomb that is just carefully primed by trauma and just and that institutional abuse. Um, so like I said, when the film jumps ahead a decade to 1984, where this seemingly stable but deeply repressed 18-year-old Billy, who's played by Robert Brian Wilson, begins adjusting to a normal adult life as this stock boy in this local toy store, which is a kind of a cruel irony that places him squarely back in the whole world of Christmas and Santa Claus is that he had a fear of. Um, but the movie it expertly manages Billy's slow psychological erosion. So excuse me. So his attempts at normal relationships, like like his crush on his coworker, is just are they're all constantly derailed by just these flashing intrusive memories of his parents' death. Um, and the Christmas season, with its kind of, you know, carols and decorations, they also act as this continuous trigger for him. Um, and the final descent is masterful in its triggering mechanism. Um, when the store's designated Santa is injured, Billy is forced to take his place. So dressed in this, the red suit, the uniform of his childhood nightmare, and just his eternal, his internal aggressor. He is a powder keg now. I mean, just the final spark comes at the staff Christmas Eve party, fueled by alcohol and rage when he sees this despicable coworker, Andy, attempting to rape Pamela. Um, and here Billy doesn't just snap; he fully manifests just the ethos instilled by Mother Superior, and declaring that punishment is good. He snaps, just embracing that role, of this avenging Santa. And the following descent into this vengeful spree is just executed with just this shocking brutality. Um, so, as a fan of Christmas horror, what elevates Silent Night, Deadly Night is just just that audacious exploitation, of festive imagery. The film operates at this high level, of just technical efficiency that was typical, of the best '80s slashers, but the setting just makes the violence stand out even more. Every act of violence is linked to the holiday season, just turning these kind of symbols of joy into these instruments of demise. Um, and the kills are iconic here, particularly for those, who appreciate these practical, inventive effects. Like, the first one I think of is the Christmas lights strangulation that Billy, where he uses a string of Christmas lights that were, meant for decoration, obviously, to hang this predatory coworker of his, Andy, just turning that cheerful illumination into this, you know, deadly noose. Um, and I think one probably the most iconic kill in the entire movie, it was just the antler impalement. It's I think it's one of the most like famously shocking and just wonderfully ridiculous kills. Um, and it features Linnea Quigley. So Billy breaks into this house where this young couple is having sex, and he impales Denise, who's played by Linnea Quigley, through this the skull on a set of this mounted deer antlers, and it transforms that holiday decoration into this kind of gruesome weapon. Um, it's an unforgettable piece of uh, of holiday horror. When it comes to the kills. Um, and then the climax is reserved for for Billy's favorite tool, which is the axe. After delivering this moment of just chilling moral ambiguity, um, sparing the nice little girl Cindy, but giving her this box cutter that he had just used. He takes to the streets and he executes this neighborhood bully by decapitating him with the axe for stealing a sled, which is a kind of a moment of this warped justice where Santa punishes the truly naughty, um, and the sequence where Billy, who is now fully committed to his Santa persona, stalks these snowy streets and just the red of his suit perfectly matching the blood of his victims. It just really kind of creates this visual masterpiece of these blend of things when it comes to like the Christmas imagery and all the imagery that's reflecting the horror of it all. This film is kinetic and brutal and just utterly just without mercy, embracing that gleeful nihilism that just makes the slasher subgenre so appealing. And I think the true measure of Silent Night, Deadly Night is not just its cinematic effectiveness, but just its powerful, immediate cultural impact. It was released by TriStar Pictures in November of 1984, and the film was despite its controversy surrounding its release, it was an instant commercial success, and it grossed $2.5 million on this modest 750K budget during its opening weekend. um However, its success, I think, came at a very steep price, which is the public outrage. And the promotional material featuring this Santa holding an axe was just viewed as this unforgivable desecration of this sacred holiday figure, especially when it was kind of um paired with all this cute Christmas imagery. um the film was met with all these protests, most famously, I think, for the organized by the parent, some kind of I forget the name of it now. It's some kind of organization. It's like the Mothers Against Santa or so. I can't remember what it was, but anyway, where they would protest, outside of these theaters. And, and even, critics like Siskel and Ebert, had these dedicated segments, of their shows to condemning this film, famously reading the producers the riot act and on air and just demanding that, TriStar would pull the picture. And they did. TriStar Pictures, they pulled the film from theaters. I think just a week or two after its release. Um, but this controversy, however, it proved to be, I think, its greatest asset in the long run. Just the outrage, it cemented the film's reputation as this object of forbidden, transgressive cinema. It became legendary among horror fans who would seek out the film on VHS and just when transformed it from this kind of flash in the pan slasher into this essential, midnight movie and just this powerful, cult classic. Um, the outrage confirms what the film achieved. It went too far. It scared people not just with violence, but just with the very idea, of undermining these, cherished, wholesomeness within, surrounding Christmas. Um, Silent Night, Deadly Night, just it forces the audience to confront the darkness. It can lurk beneath, even just the Bryce Holiday veneer. Um, and I think the film's ending also provides this kind of perfect, you know, um, capstone, just expertly setting up, the franchise that would follow. When Captain Richards shoots Billy at the orphanage, Mother Superior believes that this nightmare is over. But, you have little Ricky, Billy's younger brother, who has witnessed, Mother Superior's continued malice and, Billy's, redemptive, if murderous, act of punishment, stands over, the wheelchair bound nun. And with, this kind of cold snarl, Ricky utters that single word that defines, their tragic upbringing when he says naughty. And the cycle of trauma has not been broken. It's merely been passed on from Billy to Ricky. So, for the horror fan who just eagerly, awaits that annual blending of mistletoe and murder, Silent Night, Deadly Night is nothing short, of an essential holiday tradition. I think it stands above its imitators because it grounds its outrageous premise in just genuine, human trauma. It doesn't rely on a supernatural entity. It relies on just the cruelty, of this man and just the failure of these institutions. It dissects the concept of good and evil through this kind of warped lens of a psychologically broken young man. Um, and it culminates in just this spree of just beautifully, staged Christmas themed violence. Um, the film itself is just a raw and mean spirited and brilliantly executed piece of just exploitation cinema that deserves, I think, every ounce, of its cult status. Um, it is a necessary counterpoint to just the sweetness of the season, reminding us that sometimes the most terrifying figure, lurking in the shadows, isn't an otherworldly monster. It's simply just a man in a Santa suit, driven insane by grief and just that relentless demand for punishment. Um, so if you love Christmas, you love horror, definitely put Silent Night, Deadly Night, at the very top of your list. Um, it's truly just the gift that keeps on giving, and it provides that gift is these blood soaked antlers and a good sharp axe. So yeah, I love this movie, and I love it so much. I wanted to talk about the rest of the films in its franchise. Well, up until at least part five. So, like I said, with my love for the original is not just about the shock value, or the bloodshed. It's just it's about Billy Chapman's tragic descent into madness, and is rooted in this kind of profoundly scarring childhood trauma, just filtered through the lens of all this holiday iconic imagery. Um, it's about that uncomfortable blend of just that these joyful carols and these brutal murders. And it's a film that asks, what if the symbols of comfort and joy became these instruments of fear? And it answers with a resounding, chilling what if. So with such reverence for the inaugural nightmare, approaching its sequels was always going to be this kind of journey that was fraught with both apprehension and just a sort of a weird sense of excitement. Would they uphold the original's legacy? Would they delve deeper into the psychological torment, or embrace that campiness inherent in the premise of it all? Um, or would they simply be cheap cash ins? Just diluting that powerful brew that made the first film so special. Um, So I've watched these films several times over the years. I've immersed myself in that kind of these following four installments, these sequels from the original Silent Night Deadly Night. So we have Silent Night Deadly Night Part 2, Silent Night Deadly Night 3, Better Watch Out, Silent Night Deadly Night 4, Initiation, and Silent Night Deadly Night 5, The Toy Maker. So, and I can confirm that the journey through these films is a very wild and unpredictable and just often times baffling as one might expect, from a horror franchise that it started with such a controversial bang. Um, it's a saga that veers wildly in tone and quality, and even genre. Which is a testament to just the chaotic nature of direct to video horror in the late '80s and the early '90s, um, and just a fascinating case study in how a powerful concept can be stretched and reshaped and ultimately almost entirely abandoned. uh, so starting with the first sequel to Silent Night Deadly Night, which is Silent Night Deadly Night Part 2. um, so the this immediate follow-up to the original is a film that has over the decades transcended its humble origins and the budgetary constraints to achieve this kind of level of cult infamy, almost, almost eclipsing its predecessor, and that's crazy to say. So this one was directed and co-written by Lee Harry, and it attempts to continue, that bloody saga through the eyes of Billy Chapman's younger brother, Ricky. Um, and my anticipation for this film was tinged with a morbid curiosity as I, approached it many years ago for the first time. Um, just um, I'd already heard about its reputation for being kind of a Frankenstein's monster of a sequel, because it cobbled together from these significant portions of the original. But this knowledge, however, did not prepare me for that sheer kind of madness that unfolded on screen. Um, so the plot picks up with Ricky, here played by Eric Freeman, and he's institutionalized, much like his brother Billy, before him, and he's recounting his life story to this psychiatrist, detailing his own trauma, stemming from the same Christmas Eve murders that scarred Billy, and just his descent, into this kind of similar psychopathic rage, and it culminates in his own killing spree. Um, the premise itself is sound for a slasher sequel, exploring just the ripple effect of this family trauma, just the idea of a bad seed, passing down through generations. However, the execution is where part two truly distinguishes itself, or rather, um, derails itself, I guess you could say. So the most infamous aspect of Silent Night, Deadly Night Part Two, um, and indeed the film's very foundation, is just its reliance on approximately 25 minutes of archive footage from the original film. Now, this wasn't just a nod or a brief flashback. It was a substantial chunk of the runtime presented as Ricky's memories, um, which is, the more it gets into it, like the scenes that it shows that he is remembering, um, it makes it even more ridiculous. But and as a fan of the original, it's a bizarre experience. On one hand, it felt like a just a blatant, almost cynical budgetary shortcut. This desperate attempt to pad out a feature film with just existing material. And on the other, the way it's integrated, or rather, I guess, abruptly inserted into Ricky's narrative kind of creates this disorienting, almost meta textual effect. Um, and Ricky describes events that we then see play out, from the first film, sometimes with this kind of awkward voiceover. It's less a seamless, story device and more of a, patchwork kind of quilt sewn with just cheap thread. And I know that's a really weird, like, comparison, but it is. I mean, like this, this, this kind of creative choice, which was born of just necessity, and almost immediately marks part two as this unique beast, in the horror landscape. Um, but where part two truly shines is, in its original material, particularly the performance of Eric Freeman as Ricky. If Billy Chapman's madness was this slow, agonizing burn, and Ricky's is an explosive, unhinged, counterpart. So Eric Freeman's portrayal is just a masterclass in overacting, just a theatrical, wide-eyed, scenery-chewing spectacle that is impossible to look away from. His monologues, just delivered with an almost manic intensity, directly, to his psychiatrist, um, is a gold mine of just these quotable lines and just bizarre facial expressions. And he's not subtle, he's not nuanced, but he is mesmerizing. And, and then of course there's the garbage day. This single line delivered with just this eyebrow raised to the heavens, this maniacal grin, and just, followed by that, ridiculously, slow shooting of his man taking out his trash, has really become the film's enduring legacy, and just this cornerstone of just internet meme culture. Um, it's a moment of just pure, unadulterated, just camp that perfectly encapsulates, the film's accidental brilliance. Um, it's nonsensical, poorly executed by, traditional standards, yet utterly unforgettable. Um, from a fan's perspective, it's not just a funny moment. It's this kind of window into this, delightful absurdity that low budget horror can occasionally, stumble into. Um, it's a moment that makes you lean forward, wondering if you're witnessing genius or or utter incompetence, or perhaps both, simultaneously. Um, and beyond the whole garbage day stuff, Ricky's killing spree is just this really this really weird affair, just lacking the grim, almost, ritualistic quality of Billy's murders. The kills are often random, just driven by these petty annoyances or, perceived slights, just rather than this, a deep seated, like, Santa induced psychosis. Um, I mean, there's the infamous umbrella impalement, the car battery electrocution, and just a general sense of Ricky, lashing out against a world that has wronged him, embodying this more generic, um, although, extremely flamboyant rage, killer. Just the Christmas elements are far less pronounced than in the original here. While Ricky's initial trauma is rooted in Christmas, his subsequent acts of violence are not, explicitly, themed around the holiday until the very end. Um, the original film reveled in its kind of transgressive use of Santa, whereas part two, largely uses Christmas as this ticking clock, for Ricky's release and his eventual escape. Um, But Lee Harry's direction, was constrained by budget and just the awkward, insertion of flashback footage is serviceable at best. The pacing is choppy, the dialogue is often very clunky, and just the overall impression is one of a film struggling to find its footing. Yeah, it's precisely, these limitations that, ironically, contribute to its charm though. I know that sounds confusing, but it's just, it's the truth. It's a raw, unpolished gem of just accidental horror comedy, and as a fan of Christmas horror, I appreciate the attempt to continue the story, even if it devolves into something, completely different. Um, it's a film that, that, despite, its numerous flaws, has just carved out this unique and just cherished place, you know, in cult cinema. And it's a testament to just that unexpected power of a truly unhinged performance. In this case, that unhinged performance comes from Eric Freeman, and it's a film that I revisit not for its scares or its, narrative cohesion, just for that sheer, undeniable, chaotic entertainment value. Um, and Yeah, I highly suggest checking. If you've watched the original Silent Night, Daily Night, I suggest watching all of these films. But that brings me to the next one in the franchise, which is Silent Night, Daily Night 3, Better Watch Out from 1989. And so this takes place 2 years after the chaotic brilliance of part two. And the franchise attempted to regain some semblance of narrative control with Silent Night, Deadly Night 3. Um, this entry immediately piqued my interest because um, it has Bill Moseley in it. And so Bill Moseley plays uh, Ricky this time around. And just, you know, it serves as a direct sequel to part two, but it shifts gears considerably. So we find Ricky Caldwell, like I said, played by Bill Moseley, from Texas Chainsaw Massacre Part 2, House of Thousand Corpses, Devil's Rejects, just to name a few. And Ricky is in this comatose state, after being shot at the end of the previous film. But in this kind of audacious move, Ricky is depicted with part of his skull removed, revealing his exposed, pulsating brain, and it's encased in this like clear dome and wired up to this machinery. Um, so this visual, alone is a very bold statement. Immediately, establishing this kind of a tone that grapples between the grotesque and the slightly ludicrous. It's a striking image that positions Ricky as less of a grounded psychopath and more of a, science fiction monster. And this transition, it alienated some, but for a horror fan, I mean, it's an intriguing evolution, honestly, just pushing the boundaries of what a slasher sequel can be. Um, so the new narrative hook revolves around Laura. Laura is this blind teenager with these psychic powers who possesses this telepathic link to Ricky. And this immediately steers the franchise away from its slasher roots and into the realm of the more supernatural, um, which is, a significant departure from, the grounded trauma induced madness of the original. So Laura is traveling to her grandmother's house for the Christmas holiday with her brother Chris and, his girlfriend Jerry. And Ricky, sensing Laura's connection, awakens from his coma and he's still obsessed with Christmas and just driven by his fractured psychology. He begins to stalk her. Sorry. So the direction here in this film brings a decidedly different sensibility to the series. Gone is the frenetic, often slapdash pacing of part two. Instead, Silent Night, Deadly Night 3, Better Watch Out, adopts a slower, more deliberate pace, just focusing on atmosphere and character development to a degree. But the film takes its time, building tension through psychological dread rather than these overt jump scares. There's an almost dreamlike quality to some of Laura's psychic visions, and the director here, attempts to imbue just the narrative with this sense of, fatalism and quiet menace. Um, Bill Moseley as Ricky is thankfully more restrained in this outing. While his performance in part two was from Eric Freeman was this glorious spectacle of just unhinged camp. Here just the physical limitations like the brain dome, the more deliberate movements. It forces him into this more menacing, less overtly theatrical portrayal. Um, he's still Ricky, with his deeply disturbed fixation on Christmas and his family, but there's this quieter intensity to his madness. The film smartly um, uses his these physical limitations, just turning him into this relentless, almost monstrous force, rather than the manic individual of the previous film. Um, but the integration of Christmas into the narrative is present, but also feels kind of somewhat, not important to the core plot. So the holiday serves as the backdrop for Laura's journey and, and Ricky's awakening, but it doesn't permeate that horror in the same in that same kind of, you know, uh, that way that the original portrayed it. Ricky's obsession is still linked to the holiday, but the film doesn't lean into that blend of joy and terror as heavily. Um, the kills are less about audacious spectacle and more about grim inevitability. Just fitting just the film's more somber tone. And for a fan like me, who appreciates just that psychological depth of the original, part three is this fascinating, if not entirely successful experiment. You know, uh, the director here tries to elevate just the material beyond these mere slasher things, just injecting it with this sense of psychological horror and just even a touch of the gothic. And I appreciate that for sure. It's certainly a more coherent and competently made film than part two is, but in striving for seriousness, it loses some of that accidental charm and the unforgettable moments that made part two this cult classic. It feels like a genuine attempt to end the original storyline, um, and you know with this bit more of like exploring the lasting trauma, in this different light. Um, this film marks the end of the Billy and Ricky storyline and provides this sense of, closure to the original narrative, although, one wrapped in a slightly bizarre, um, psychic infused package, I guess. Um, while it might not be one of my favorites of the series, it is undeniably a very unique entry, you know, that just that deserves, recognition, I think, for attempting to break the mold a bit. Um, but that brings me to the next film in the franchise, which is Silent Night, Deadly Night 4: Initiation from 1990. Um, so this is where things got really weird. So Silent Night, Deadly Night 4: Initiation, just stylized on screen, as Initiation, Silent Night, Deadly Night 4, um, represents the most radical departure in the entire franchise. Um, so this was directed by body horror maestro Brian Yesna. And Brian Yesna from many things, from the Reanimator franchise to Society to lots of others out there. This film throws out virtually all connections to the previous installments, save for the actual title, Silent Night, Deadly Night branding, which by this point feels almost like a cruel joke on the audience. So, as a fan of the original's very specific brand of Christmas horror, this entry was a complete head scratcher when I first watched this years ago. Just eventually, settling in this kind of state of just you know like a very weird appreciation almost for just the audacity that this film brings. Um, so this film, you know, is bears no resemblance to the previous films. As it drops the storyline of Billy and Ricky entirely. Um, but in this is I think a colossal understatement. But Initiation isn't just a soft reboot. It's a hard left turn into this entirely different genre. Um, Brian Yuzna, like I said, known for his works on things like Reanimator and Society, just brings this distinctive vision for grotesque, surreal body horror to the table, and the result is a film that feels utterly disconnected from everything that came before it in this franchise. So the plot follows Kim, who is this Los Angeles newspaper reporter investigating this, unexplained gruesome death of a woman who spontaneously combusts with, insects bursting from her body. And as Kim digs deeper, she becomes entangled with this bizarre, ancient coven of Lilith worshiping witches who are preparing her for, a ritual on Christmas Eve. That's right, witches. So Lilith, the demon from hell, and body horror on Christmas Eve. The only connection to the original series thematic elements is the presence of Christmas, used here as a specific deadline for this coven's ritual, rather than a catalyst for a psychological breakdown or murderous rage. Um, the inclusion of a character named Ricky, who's here played by Clint Howard, is truly just a bizarre, almost mocking coincidence. It serves only to confuse anyone looking for continuity. And Brian Yesna's involvement is the key to understanding this film. He took the original screenplay and just reshaped it, incorporating his signature themes, and this is evident, in the film's pervasive body horror elements and just the overt references to, just which the references to Franz Kafka's The Metamorphosis. So the transformations, the insect creatures, uh, just the all the practical effects, which were also crafted by the legendary Screaming Mad George. Um, they're all hallmarks of Brian Yuzna's style, and just this that stark contrast to the slasher roots, you know, of the franchise. Um, I think for a fan of Brian Yuzna's work, this is a fascinating, if misplaced, entry. I mean, I think if this did not have the Silent Night, Deadly Night uh, title included in it, um, it could definitely be looked at differently by a lot of horror fans. Um, and that's why I say, for a fan of Silent Night, Deadly Night, it's so weird. It's very strange. Um, so I think the film's strength though lies in its that visual creativity and just that willingness to embrace the bizarre. Um, Screaming Mad George's special effects are gnarly and memorable here. And just creating this genuinely unsettling imagery of physical decay and monstrous transformation and um you know Maud Adams in this adds a touch of class to the proceedings as this enigmatic matriarch of the cult, and Clint Howard as the aforementioned unrelated Ricky character um delivers just his that usual quirky, intense performance that you would come to expect from Clint Howard in one of his films. The atmosphere, is thick with just dread and unease and just the film successfully establishes, its own kind of creepy mythology, although one completely, divorced from its supposed franchise. Um, and the Christmas setting, while present, feels almost incidental to the horror. It's a backdrop, a time marker for the ritual, but it doesn't carry that same weight or that ironic commentary as it did in the original Silent Night, Deadly Night. The horror here stems from just ancient rituals and that psychological, and just grotesque physical transformations that not from a warped perception of Santa Claus or anything. It's a film that leans heavily into the supernatural and that cosmic horror. It's a far cry from the grounded slasher that started it all. Um, but that brings me to the last film in the Silent Night, Deadly Night franchise I'm gonna be talking about for tonight. Um, and that's Silent Night, Deadly Night 5, the toy maker from 1991. And just following that radical departure of Initiation, this fifth installment, Silent Night, Deadly Night 5, the toy maker, continues that anthology approach. It's opting for another standalone narrative unrelated to the first three films. Um, so this film holds a unique place in the series for two principal reasons. Its intriguing premise involving murderous toys and the controversial casting of Mickey Rooney. So, for a fan of the original, Mickey Rooney's involvement sends this kind of shiver of irony down your spine, and just given his his vocal condemnation of the first film in 1984. So his presence here feels like this kind of atonement, and or perhaps this desperate grab for a paycheck. Um, Either way, it adds this unexpected layer of just meta commentary, to the film. Um, and the plot centers around this young boy named Derek, who witnesses his father's death by this mysterious, seemingly sentient toy on Christmas Eve. And the incident leaves Derek traumatized and mute, and the boy and his mother Sarah are then drawn into this world of of Joe Petto, who's played by Mickey Rooney, and he's just just this reclusive, eccentric toy maker, and his equally strange son Pino, who was played by Brian Bremer. You may know Brian from Pumpkinhead or the movie Spontaneous Combustion. And Brian is very frequent within the horror convention circuit nowadays. Um, but as the story unfolds, a series of increasingly bizarre and deadly toys appear. Just targeting the family and those around them. Hinting at these kind of dark secrets. Residing within Peto's workshop. And the small community. And it took me like forever to kind of to realize the connection with Mickey Rooney's character, Joe Petto, because if you think about it, um, Joe Petto, Geppetto, so like from Pinocchio, and I thought that was kind of clever in a way. But like with when your last name is Petto, it sounds a lot like pedo, uh, or and it kind of makes it really weird. Um, but but anyway, I don't know. I just wanted to mention that. But Silent Night, Deadly Night 5, the toy maker, it leans into that sci-fi horror with this kind of touch of gothic mystery, rather than just the supernatural cult horror, of initiation or that slasher, psychological horror of the first three films. Um, the central gimmick is, of course, the killer toys. And while not as overtly gory as some entries, the film strives for a creepy atmosphere, playing on just the inherent childhood fear of inanimate objects coming to life. And the toys themselves are designed to be unsettling. These grotesque dolls, these mechanical men, and just these other creations that feel, more like instruments of dread than they are playthings. Excuse me. But the the scares are effective in spurts, just relying on suspense and just that uncanny, rather than overt violence. And Mickey Rooney's performance as Joe Petto is surprisingly quite good. Actually, he delivers this unsettling portrayal of this man that's consumed by his craft. Just and he's just a very eccentric guy that is kind of masking this more deeper, sinister truth. Um, the irony of his casting is not lost, I think, on anyone familiar with the franchise's history. And it just kind of adds, another layer of dark humor to the film, however unintentional. Um, the film also features, cameo appearances from, um, you know, people that were previously in the franchise, and specifically ones that appeared in part four, and just kind of creates this kind of subtle, almost Easter egg like connection that doesn't extend beyond, shared cast members, reinforcing the anthology nature of these later sequels. And Christmas once again serves as a crucial backdrop. The deaths begin on Christmas Eve. The toys are central to the holiday season. In this sense, the toy maker arguably feels more linked to the spirit of Christmas horror than Initiation did, even though it's completely abandons, the Santa slasher premise. Um, it taps into the just that childhood fascination and fear associated with toys, during the holidays, twisting this symbol of joy into a kind of a harbinger of death. Um, and again, the direction, crafts a somewhat slow burn, atmospheric film. The pacing is deliberate, allowing the mystery to just unfold gradually, and the focus is on building suspense around the toys and and just just the pedos family secrets. And while it doesn't reach the the heights of the original's psychological depth of part two's accidental cult status, it manages to be this this competently made, if somewhat forgettable, B movie horror, and it aims for a more nuanced, psychological kind of terror, just focusing on childhood trauma and just the corruption of innocence and just themes that echo the first film, although through this kind of completely different lens this time around. Um, but for me, as a Christmas horror fan, I think that the Toy Maker is a mild curiosity. It's not particularly scary, nor is it hilariously bad or anything, but it's just this earnestly made attempt at holiday themed horror, that leverages its title for brand recognition. It's yet another example of the series' wild genre experimentation, just cementing its legacy, I think, as one of the most unpredictable horror franchises in history. Um, it's a film that that exists and occasionally entertains, but ultimately it leaves this a little lasting impression beyond just the oddity of its premise and just the casting of its lead in Mickey Rooney. Um, but the Silent Night Deadly Night film series, just taken as a whole, is a remarkable case study, in just the evolution or perhaps de-evolution of a horror franchise. What began as this genuinely controversial, psychologically rich slasher film transformed into this wild, unpredictable anthology of just varying quality and genre. And the legacy and impact of these sequels are multifaceted, um, shaping not only the perception of the original, but also just contributing to that broader landscape of Christmas horror. Um, and the original film's shadow looms large over all these sequels. Um, Silent Night, Deadly Night redefined Christmas horror by injecting just genuine psychological trauma and transgressive violence into the holiday season. It provoked um, outrage precisely because it dared to defile cherished symbols. And the sequels either attempted to capitalize on that transgressive spirit, or in their later iterations simply borrowed that recognizable title without much concern for the original's thematic core or whatever. Um, and I think cult status is perhaps the most undeniable impact of the series, particularly thanks to Silent Night Part Two. While the original was certainly a cult classic, Part Two's accidental brilliance, just largely driven by Eric Freeman's over the top performance and the whole garbage day scene, it really cemented its place in horror meme culture and just garnered this new generation of iconic fans, I mean ironic fans. So this this phenomenon really highlights how bad that cinema can become culturally significant in transforming perceived flaws into unique strengths. And part two is a living testament to that idea because sometimes truly terrible filmmaking by traditional metrics can be vastly more entertaining and impactful than a merely mediocre one. Um, and the series as a whole, just exemplifies that direct to video boom of the late 1980s and in the early 1990s. This era saw numerous horror franchises churn out sequels after sequel after sequel just at a rapid pace. Often with these kind of diminishing budgets and just you know these increasingly outlandish plots. The Silent Night, Deadly Night sequels showcase just that creative freedom or desperation, of this period where established mythology could be discarded, and new genres embraced, and just these familiar titles used as mere marketing tools for otherwise unrelated films. um, this era was crucial for keeping horror alive in the home video market, and Silent Night, Deadly Night was just a prominent player in this entire ecosystem. Um, and in terms of Christmas horror niche, the series, despite its erratic quality, undoubtedly broadened, the horizons of holiday themed horror. And while the original set the benchmark for slasher carnage during Christmas, the sequels, by venturing into psychic horror, body horror, killer toys, all demonstrated just that versatility of the Christmas backdrop. They showed that the holiday could serve as a canvas for this wide array of horror subgenres, just expanding the definition beyond just Santa with an axe, and even when the films lost their narrative focus, um, the decision to always set them around Christmas maintained, a thread, however thin, a thin thread just to the initial concept. And this continuous output, regardless of quality, helps solidify Christmas horror as this recognizable and viable subgenre. Um, the enduring appeal of the title is, further evidenced just by, the various remakes and reboots. In 2012, Anchor Bay Films released a loose remake entitled Silent Night. And this film attempted to return to the slasher roots of the original, just focusing on this Santa clad, killer terrorizing a small town. And for fans of the original, it was a welcome return to form, after the various genre detours of the sequels. Um, it was a more direct reinterpretation of the classic premise. Um, and it had a theatrical release, which is the first theatrical release for the franchise since Part Two in 1987. So it signaled a renewed interest in the brand, and while it wasn't a critical darling or anything, it showed that the concept still had legs, and that audiences crave that specific brand of Yuletide Terror. And I thought that I would just mention that, even though I didn't watch that one this year as a part of my 500 movies in 2025. Um, I thought I would mention that because that's not the only remake that is part of this franchise. So the announcement of another remake, Silent Night, Deadly Night, which is scheduled for December 12th, 2025, which is 1 week away, when the new remake of Silent Night, Deadly Night will be released. And it just that I think that again further solidifies the franchise's improbable longevity. Um, this signals that the core concept, a killer Santa, remains powerful and marketable. And even if the subsequent narrative iterations of the original saga were uneven. It speaks less to the lasting impacts of parts 2 through 5 and more to the enduring transgressive power of the original concept. Um, the title itself has become this iconic piece of Christmas horror. Just a shorthand for holiday fear, and is thus ripe for continued reimagining. And from a fan's perspective, the franchise evolution has been a roller coaster, no doubt. From just the raw psychological slasher of the original to the campy, unforgettable chaos of part 2, to the more serious but less memorable genre shifts of part 3, and just the outright surrealism of part 4, and then the mild sci-fi horror of part 5. The Silent Night Deadly Night series is a bizarre journey. It's a testament just to the unpredictable nature of low budget filmmaking, and just that willingness of producers to exploit this brand name, no matter how weird the connection is. It's a saga that, despite its many flaws and departures, ultimately contributes to that rich tapestry of horror, offering this kind of diverse, array of scares and just curiosities. But I guess in conclusion, my journey through Silent Night, Deadly Night, parts 2 through 5, has been nothing short, of this fascinating, often bewildering, and ultimately rewarding experience. Um, as a fan who cherishes the original film's kind of audacious blend of Christmas cheer and psychological horror, I approach these sequels every time I come around to watch these sequels of Silent Night, Deadly Night with this kind of mixture of reverence and trepidation, I guess you could say. Um, and what I found, is this franchise that, much like Christmas itself, is this complex, multi-layered beast. Sometimes beautiful, often garish, and always but it's always in some way memorable. I'll say that. So the original Silent Night, Deadly Night remains for me, the absolute undisputed king of this franchise. Its raw power, its uncomfortable themes, and just its sheer willingness to offend. It really set this kind of benchmark that none of its successors could truly match. It's a classic of the whole holiday horror subgenre. Just a film that understood, that powerful dread, in just corrupting the symbols of just this childhood innocence. Um, and the Silent Night, Deadly Night sequels are, this fascinating, often frustrating, but, never boring. I'll say that journey through just this chaotic landscape of late 80s and early 90s horror cinema. Um, they represent just a franchise that continuously, reinvented itself, sometimes for better, mostly for worse. But if I'm being honest, but always, with this kind of certain audacity. Um, and while none of them truly capture, that powerful, magic and controversy of the original, um, each of them offers something unique, I think, to the dedicated horror fan. Be it cult camp, artistic ambition, grotesque body horror, or just simply that's that quirky charm of a bygone era. Um, my love for Christmas horror remains undiminished, if not enriched, by this kind of diverse collection of these Christmas horror nightmares. The original stands alone, just as this towering inferno of holiday fear. Um, but its sequels in all their bizarre glory, offer this very sprawling, unpredictable, and often strangely enduring extension, of its bloody legacy. Um, it's a reminder, I think, that sometimes the most twisted gifts come in the most unexpected packages. So I'll leave you with that when it comes to the Silent Night, Deadly Night franchise. So I got a few more I want to talk about before I end this stream tonight. So this next one on the list, this is a 1997 direct-to-video masterpiece, Jack Frost. And no, I'm not talking about the Michael Keaton movie. I'm talking about the horror film from 1997. Um, and again, as a devoted fan of both Christmas cheer and festive fear, um, I argue that Jack Frost is not merely a bad movie. It is a spectacularly unique celebration of low budget ingenuity and just high concept camp that perfectly encapsulates just the trashy joy of 1990s schlock movies. Um, it is the quintessential midnight movie for anyone who appreciates, a slasher villain who talks as much trash as he sheds body parts. So Jack Frost introduces us to Jack Frost, who is voiced by Scott McDonald, and he's a notorious and gleefully vicious serial killer. Finally facing his reckoning. And the film opens on this snowy December night as Jack is being transported to his execution. Passing through this ironically named town of Snowmonton, and this is the domain of Sheriff Sam Tyler, who's the man who finally put Jack behind bars, and he's the target of Jack's promised chilling vengeance. So the setup is pure, just glorious 90s nonsense. Jack manages to kill his guard, and the transfer vehicle immediately collides with this genetic research truck. And, unlike common movie criminals who simply die in a crash, Jack encounters this futuristic, highly corrosive acid labeled as experimental chemical designed to preserve DNA against nuclear holocaust or whatever. Because of course it is, I mean, but Jack melts, physically dissolving into the snow outside, and the killer doesn't just die; he fuses. Um, Mutating into this monstrous snowman, just ready to continue his rampage with this freshly frosted body, I guess. Um, so, what follows all this is an inventive, if ludicrous, spree of just seasonally themed violence. Um, the kills here are the heart of the film's appeal, I think, just showcasing this delightful, dedication to utilizing Christmas imagery in just the most twisted ways possible. Um, Old Man Harper is swiftly dispatched. Just setting the stage, and soon local bully Billy is killed. By being decapitated after being pushed into this oncoming sled. And that's it's an early indication that Jack is using the very mechanism of holiday fun against his victims. So we witness just we witness murder via an axe stuffed down a throat. Just the spectacularly gruesome demise of Billy's mother Sally, strangled with Christmas lights, her face shoved into glass ornaments, and just and finished off with this light up snowflake rammed into her skull. Um, so the film truly cements its place in just the when it comes to outrageous horror with one deeply tasteless yet undeniably iconic sequence involving Jill, played by Shannon Elizabeth here in her film debut, and inside of this shower. So after luring her into the relaxation of this of a hot shower by dissolving himself into the water, Jack re-solidifies, trapping Jill, and who's terrified, and just this the ensuing attack where the killer snowman utilizes a carrot, I should say, strategically placed on his crotch, uh, has become the film's most notorious moment. It's shocking, in its audacity and just, profoundly ridiculous in execution. And it really has epitomized, the film's commitment to pushing, every boundary of decency and logic. It's so ridiculous. Um, but the climax sees Sam Taylor, or Sam Tyler, however you want to say his name, um, just basically racing against time now, and he's assisted by FBI agents Manners and Stone, who's revealed to be a representative of the genetic research company, is delivering that infamous human soul exists as a chemical monologue, and the attempts to stop Jack using these conventional means, fail spectacularly. The blow dryers drive him into a furnace, but he merely evaporates and condenses back to life, murdering Agent Stone in the process. Um, the ultimate weakness of the killer snowman is discovered not through scientific deduction, but just through this accidental father son ingenuity. So Ryan, who's Sam's son, had put antifreeze into his oatmeal to keep his father warm. And when Sam throws the oat mixture at Jack's head, the the snowman recoils in pain. So the final confrontation sees Jack driven into a truck bed full of antifreeze, where he melts into this highly concentrated liquid. And the final shot, which is the bubbling container buried deep underground, assures the audience that, like Christmas debt, Jack is always destined to return. um so despite being universally panned by critics upon release, which is, I think, is a badge of honor for any film of this caliber, Jack Frost has blossomed into a cherished cult classic. Um, its impact is multifaceted, just rooted primarily in its unapologetic, camp factor and just, perfect seasonal timing. Um, First and foremost, Jack Frost is a vital piece of the direct to video lineage. It was made during this era when a compelling high concept premise could secure funding regardless of how silly the execution looked on screen. And just the puppet like design of the snowman, it's a less frightening monster but more slightly menacing mascot, really adds to that hilarity, making every kill feel like a dark, perverse joke. And crucially, the film delivers what serious critics miss, which is genuine fun. It knows precisely what it is. It's a ridiculous movie about a snowman who kills with icicles and Christmas ornaments, and plays it plays that premise to just the this absolute hilt, never pausing to take itself seriously. And Scott McDonald's voice acting, dropping constant puns, and I'm going to kill you, and I'm going to use the sharpest instrument on the tree. It's just that kind of binding agent that holds that absurdity together. um, and just transforming a typical slasher into this a black comedy spectacle. Um, and the film's lasting legacy is confirmed by its commitment to the bit, which is that the 2000 sequel, Jack Frost 2: Revenge of the Mutant Killer Snowman, which took the villain to this tropical island, just fighting the laws of thermodynamics and good taste for a second round of mayhem. So this dedication to extending a fundamentally absurd premise speaks volumes, I think, to the audience's enduring appetite for this kind of unique brand of seasonal cheese, I guess you could call it. um but for the Christmas horror fan, Jack Frost is a mandatory viewing. I think it's a necessary, glorious mess, and just a testament just to the idea that sometimes, the lower the budget and the higher the concept, the more enduring the cinematic experience is. It takes the that picturesque, cozy setting of a small snowy town and just transforms it into this landscape of gooey, pun laden carnage. Um, and while the film may fail by conventional cinematic standards, um, it succeeds wildly at holiday entertainment. I think it represents the unfiltered, goofy 90s low budget horror, delivering gore and laughs and just truly memorable, if horrifying set pieces. Um, when the traditional sentimentality of the season becomes overwhelming, Jack Frost offers, I think, that perfect cinematic antidote. Just a chillingly silly dose of mayhem that reminds us that sometimes the best gifts are wrapped in absurdity and just covered in this kind of weirdly synthetic snow. It's ugly, it's tasteless, it's brilliant. It's an essential part of my annual holiday viewing ritual. So definitely check out Jack Frost, and then hell, why not just make it a double feature and watch Michael Keaton's Jack Frost as well. All right, got two left for you folks, and then I'm out of here for the night. So the next one on this list is Dead End from 2003, and this was one that Candace, my wife Candace, had always told me about, but I had never watched it myself until now. And this movie isn't your typical Christmas horror fright fest, um, and I think that's deeply why it resonates with some fans, of Christmas horror. It foregoes that the Santa slasher or Krampus creature feature for something more insidious, which is this kind of slow burn, psychological unraveling, set against just the stark kind of isolating backdrop of a supposedly festive night. Um, the film introduces us to the Harringtons, which is this delightfully dysfunctional family. You have Frank, who is the patriarch of this family, and he's played with this kind of perfect disgruntled charm by Ray Wise of Twin Peaks fame. Um, and his suffering wife Laura, um, played by Lynn Shay, and then their son Richard, their daughter Marion, and Marion's boyfriend Brad. So Their ordeal begins when Frank, who is bored with the usual route, decides to take a shortcut on their Christmas Eve drive. And this seemingly, innocent decision, quickly snowballs into this nightmare. Um, so, this their journey down this remote, seemingly endless forest road is punctuated by just increasingly bizarre and horrifying events. So, after a near miss with another vehicle, there's this spectral like woman in white that appears at Frank's window, cradling this baby. And, Marion, who is, ever the compassionate one, suggests that they take her to a nearby cabin, offering to, follow on foot to make space. And this is where the film truly begins to kind of tighten its grip. So Brad, who's alone with this woman, discovers the horrifying truth about the baby, that it's dead. And, his terrified screams, herald the arrival of a mysterious, black hearse, which abducts him, and it leaves the family to chase after it, only to find, his mutilated body on the roadside. So this kind of, macabre like procession of events continues. And Laura, attempting to call the police, hears this woman, begging for help on the other end, which is, this kind of, it's a chilling detail that she hides from her family. And the growing tension, in the car kind of boils over, revealing Frank's disdain for Laura's family, and it, further fraying just the already strained holiday facade. Um, and, Richard becomes the next victim of this elusive hearse. His body is later discovered by, his horrified parents. And then beyond this, Laura's descent into madness just accelerates. It's culminating um, in her shooting, Frank in the leg, and then, haunted by visions of this of a deceased friend, and just just jumping. And she jumps out of the car, and just Frank in this kind of moment of desperate terror. He accidentally shoots and kills her. Mistaking her, for this woman in white. And then the film then, accelerates towards its perplexing, just brilliant climax. And Frank and Marion take Laura's body to this, seemingly abandoned ranger station where, Frank, writes this mysterious note to Marion before being attacked by the woman in white, and just driven to insanity. He beats Marion into unconsciousness and, disappears into the woods, you know, pursuing this spectral tormentor. And then, Marion awakens stranded and discovers, body bags containing her entire family. And the woman in white reappears, cryptically stating that the hearse isn't for Marion before getting in, and, the car drives away. But what the ultimate twist is what elevates Dead End from a standard horror film to a, truly memorable piece of Christmas horror. And I thought this movie was great, like for a first time watch for me. And, seeing that, in the end, Marion awakens in this hospital, heavily bandaged, informed by Dr. Marcotte that, that she and her baby are fine, after this car crash. And, a man claiming to have found the family confirms Marion was the sole survivor, and that the crash also claimed a young woman and her baby in the other car. And so the true horror, isn't just the nightmare road trip, but it's devastating real world parallel. The ending, with the doctors, um, car failing, and the man offering her a lift, in the same hearse, followed by the discovery of Frank's note, just firmly plants that entire, harrowing journey as this kind of like purgatory, like hallucination, experience just in the dying moments, or, the deep trauma of the immediate aftermath of just of a terrible, Christmas Eve accident. Um, it's a psychological gut punch, that just recontextualizes just every scream, every jump scare, just, every breakdown as the mind's kind of tortured processing of this unimaginable tragedy. Um, and Dead End has, I think, cultivated a well deserved legacy. Um, you know, just based off this one time watch, I feel just, particularly among those who, appreciate psychological horror with that kind of dark comedic edge. Cause that's definitely what I got with this film. And, while it might not have, broken box office records, I think, its impact lies in just that masterful creation of just atmosphere and just a very deeply unsettling narrative. Um, and Ray Wise and Lynn Shay deliver absolute killer performances. Just these kind of nuanced portrayals of this bickering, couple, just this really anchors that escalating, absurdity and dread. Lynn Shay in particular, just showcases that incredible range, transition from this weary wife to this, frantic, hallucinating survivor, which is like this very chilling authenticity. Um, and for a Christmas horror fan, Dead End is a treasure. I definitely recommend checking this movie out if you have not. It subverts that traditional holiday horror, um, that that traditional holiday formula by just kind of eschewing, overt slasher gore. Though there gruesome moments in the film, but it kind of switches those out for a more, uh, existential, terror. Um, the Christmas Eve setting, rather than being a backdrop for festive murder, becomes this symbol of like lost innocence and just broken promises. Um, and the ideal of family togetherness and cheer is brutally dissected here. Just, leaving behind this raw, dysfunctional core that spirals, into madness on this road to nowhere. It's a film that uses the holiday season not for immediate scares, but just to amplify, um, just to I guess just to amplify that underlying despair, and that psychological torment, just making the dead end, not just a physical location, but this kind of crushing, emotional reality. Um, but Dead End is a brilliantly crafted, chilling experience that uses its Christmas Eve setting to just to amplify its themes of family dysfunction, grief, and just that terror of the unknown. It's a film that just stays with you, I think, a long time after the credits, because even after I have watched it earlier this week, it's still sticking with me, and just I think it's a testament to its clever writing and just the strong performances and just truly unsettling atmosphere. So for um any horror fan that's looking for a film that offers a unique, disturbing, just profoundly psychological twist on holiday horror, then Dead End is an absolute must watch. Just be sure, to check your rearview mirror and maybe take the usual route this Christmas. Um, but that brings me to the last film I'm going to be talking about for horror for the holidays. And this is a long time Christmas horror favorite for me. So if I started out with my absolute favorite Christmas horror film with Black Christmas for this episode. I have to end it on a high note with another one of my absolute favorites when it comes to Christmas horror. And as someone whose idea of a perfect December involves wrestling, some eggnog, and just some gratuitously violent Christmas themed horror movies. Um, I got to talk about David Steinman's 2005 cult classic Santa's Sleigh. This isn't just a movie for me. It is a holly jolly, blood soaked affirmation of everything that I hold dear. This isn't your grandma's Silent Night, Deadly Night. This is a full blown Bill Goldberg powered sleigh ride into Yuletide madness, and I wouldn't have it any other way. Um, so Santa's Sleigh is just a unhinged black comedy slasher film that dares to ask, what if Santa Claus wasn't this benevolent, gift giver, but he was this demonic entity, forced into servitude for a millennium, and he's now finally free to unleash, his original murderous purpose. So this was written and directed by David Steinman, with Brett Ratner producing, and just the film stars none other than wrestling legend Bill Goldberg as this terrifying Santa Claus. Um, so and this movie is flanked by bizarre ensemble, including Douglas Smith, Robert Kolb, Saul Rubinek, amongst Rebecca Gayheart, Fran Drescher, Chris Kattan, just among others. And Santa's Sleigh, it just dives headfirst into this kind of ludicrous premise with just infectious glee. And it was released on December 20th, 2005. So, we are about to celebrate the 20th anniversary of this film. And it initially garnered these mixed reviews, but quickly, I think cemented its place as this cherished, watch for a specific type of horror fan. Um, Me especially. But the film wastes no time establishing its tone. So on Christmas Eve in Alberta, Canada, the Mason family, which is this wonderfully obnoxious collection of just self entitled stereotypes, are mid bicker when Santa Claus descends, their chimney. But this isn't the jolly old elf that they expected. This is Bill Goldberg's Santa, with this kind of menacing growl and this glint in his eye, proceeds to decimate this family in just a series of these incredibly creative and often, hilarious Christmas themed atrocities. And drowning the matriarch in eggnog, and impaling the patriarch with a turkey leg after force feeding him, and just using a Christmas tree star as a shuriken. These are all just the opening acts of his holiday rampage. Um, it's a blood soaked ballet of festive destruction, a true delight for anyone who loves their horror with this dark side of this dark side of humor. Um, and Santa, just riding his hell deer, which is a magnificent buffalo-like beast, then descends upon the appropriately named Hell Township, just continuing his spree of this holiday themed massacres, from slaughtering, all these strippers, at this local strip club, um, to, just creatively, um, killing this Jewish, like deli owner, Mr. Green, with his own menorah. Um, Goldberg's Santa is just this equal opportunity destroyer. I guess you could say that. Um, the the film reveals in its kind of politically incorrect, anything goes approach, making it feel wonderfully rebellious in this kind of sea of more, sanitized horror. And amidst all the chaos, we meet Nicholas Yulson, who is this teenager, living with his eccentric grandfather, who is a crackpot inventor who has prepared this bunker for this very Christmas. And Grandpa reveals the Book of Claus, which details Santa's true origin. He's the son of Satan, born of a virgin, and Christmas was originally the day of slaying. And a millennium ago, an angel defeated him in a curling match. Yeah, curling. And sentenced him to 1,000 years of present delivery. And that sentence naturally expires in 2005, freeing Santa to revert to his demonic ways. And this convoluted, utterly brilliant mythology is the engine that drives the film's premise, just justifying every over the top kill and every, gleefully evil one liner. Um, so Nicholas, is caught up in the mayhem after, visiting Mr. Green's decimated deli, finds himself the target and, bailed out by his love interest, Mary. The two are pursued by Santa in this stolen police car. And their escape, was aided by, a shotgun in Mac's truck. Um, this desperate, this desperate flight, leads them back to Grandpa's bunker, where, this showdown ensues. And while Grandpa appears to perish, these teens escape on this snowmobile, hoping Christmas Day's end will strip, Santa of his powers. And this final confrontation in the, high school gym sees him almost succumb to this Zamboni wielding Santa, only to be saved by a very much alive Grandpa, who reveals himself to be the angel who originally bested Santa 1,000 years ago. And with Christmas officially over, Santa's powers, wane, and he flees, and his hell deer, tragically shot down by Mary's bazooka wielding father. So the film's ending brings this classic horror twist that, Pastor Timmons is found dead in this Santa suit, presumed the killer, while the real Santa boards a flight to the North Pole under the alias Mr. Satan. And Nicholas, now wise to the demonic threat, pledges to finish what his grandfather started, sealing his and Mary's budding romance with this kiss. And the post-credit scene with Santa looking over, his naughty list and asking who's next is that perfect chilling cherry on the top of this bloody Sunday. Um, and, for a wrestling fan like myself, Bill Goldberg in the role of Santa Claus is nothing short of inspired genius. Just his entire persona, which is built on raw power, unyielding intensity, and just a menacing presence, really translates perfectly into this demonic Santa Claus. When he says "Who's next?" in the wrestling ring, it's a promise of pain, and when he says it as Santa, it's this promise of this holiday theme, dismemberment. And Goldberg doesn't just act in this movie; he embodies the character. Um, This actually might be my favorite thing that Goldberg has ever done. Um, but his Santa isn't just strong. He's just physically dominant and just effortlessly tossing people and crushing objects and just delivering beatdowns with that brutal, efficiency of a spear or a jackhammer, they would in the ring. Um, and just that the deep growl and the piercing gaze of just, of the sheer undeniable presence. It's everything a wrestling fan would love about Goldberg, just amplified by the absurdity, of the premise here. Um, he carries the film's horror and comedic elements just on his shoulders here, basically, just kind of making Santa terrifyingly cool rather than just a caricature. Um, this wasn't just stunt casting; it was perfect casting, I think. And Santa's sleigh has, against all odds, carved out this kind of significant niche, as a beloved cult classic now, particularly among fans, of holiday horror and B movies, and just its unapologetic, embrace of its own ridiculousness, just coupled with just genuinely creative kills and just a surprisingly original mythology definitely sets it apart. And while films like Black Christmas or Silent Night, Deadly Night are foundational to holiday horror, Santa's Sleigh, offers a unique, darkly comedic twist, that few others attempt. Um, and it doesn't just have a killer Santa. It has a demonic wrestling superstar killer Santa with this elaborate backstory. Um, and for wrestling fans, um, yeah, Brandon, that's a good question. I wonder if Bret Hart has ever watched it. Um, Probably not. I would guess probably not. But if he has, I'm sure that he would give it like a 0 out of 10 or something, just because Goldberg's in it. But like I said, for wrestling fans, it remains Goldberg's most memorable and arguably best film role. Just a perfect showcase for his unique charisma outside the wrestling ring. It proved that he could be more than just this destructive force as a wrestler. He could be this destructive force with this, twisted sense of humor and just that perfect, sense of timing um, for a sinister, one liner. And the film's rewatchability, I think, is incredibly high. Like I said, this is a top Christmas horror favorite for me. Every Christmas when just the usual festive stuff starts to kind of feel a bit too um, too usual, I guess you could say. Santa's sleigh is just that perfect antidote. It's just a joyous, celebration of bad taste. A darkly comedic romp that just never takes itself too seriously. And just making it a staple for the annual holiday, viewing parties. Um, its impact lies not in critical acclaim, but just in the sheer, unadulterated joy that it brings to those of us who appreciate, horror that's both festive and ferociously fun. Um, it isn't Santa Slate isn't a masterpiece by any means, and it certainly won't win over everyone. But I think for me, who I'm a passionate fan of professional wrestling, and just it has that festive cheer of Christmas and just that that deliciously dark corner of a holiday horror. Um, it's an absolute amazing movie. Um, Bill Goldberg's demonic Santa is an iconic presence. I feel just delivering these brutal kills just with this mischievous grin and a growl that just reverberates with the power of of a thousand spears, I guess you could say. Um, it's a film that knows exactly what it is, and this is ridiculous, violent, and hilarious, twisted take on Christmas, and just it executes its vision with this kind of unparalleled gusto. If you've ever secretly wished for a Christmas movie where Santa dishes out pain instead of presents, where the eggnog is used for drowning, and just where a wrestling legend redefines holiday fear, then grab your popcorn, a warm blanket, and just settle in because Santa's sleigh could be your new favorite Christmas tradition. But guys, I guess that is it for me tonight. I want to thank everyone who either watched this live and was here in the chat, or if you're watching this on replay. Highly appreciate you guys for stopping by and listening to me ramble about these movies. Please drop me a comment below on what your favorite Christmas horror movie is and why. I would love to talk about that with you. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up. I'd really appreciate that. If you're new to the channel, please hit that subscribe button down below to catch more videos from me like this one. My next video will be this Sunday, where I'll be covering several of the Rankin Bass Christmas classics like Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer, Santa Claus is Coming to Town, Little Drummer Boy, and so forth. So if you grew up like me watching all these Rankin Bass stop motion animation classics, and you're a huge fan of them like me, then stop by on Sunday. So it'll be sometime Sunday evening when I'll be doing that stream, talking about all those. That one should be a lot of fun. But as always, click that bell for any kind of future notifications. But with all that said, guys, I'm Crater. This is CraterMania. I love you guys. Have a good night.